Kasha and the Devil, or the Clinging Vine. Now there was once a woman called Kasha, and she had a fine house in the village and a nice garden, for all the good it did her. Because Kasha was so bad-tempered and critical and sharp-tongued that not even the lowliest laborer wished to marry her. And never mind keeping any hired hands, because as soon as they started any bit of work on her land, she'd be at them, shouting so loudly and telling them how it should be done that you could hear her a mile away. And so by the time Kasha was 40, she was still single and as sour as vinegar. Now every Sunday in the village, there used to be a dance at the tavern. And Kasha would always go. And as soon as the pipes struck up, all the young men would walk into the tavern, and all the girls would come and stand outside the tavern and look in the windows. And as the music got more lively, the men would come out one by one and beckon to the girls, "Come on in and dance." And they'd go and they'd dance and they'd dance. And Kasha was always like right the first one looking at the window to watch all the dancers. And by the time this one Sunday came around, this one particular Sunday, she was in a foul mood and feeling all angry, and she just walked right into the tavern and took a seat right by the stove. And she was sitting there and she said to herself, "I'm going to dance today if it has to be with the devil himself." Oh dear. And moments later, wouldn't you know it, the door bangs open and in walks a handsome, tall man wearing hunter's green. And he walked over and he took a table right next to Kasha's table, and he ordered some drinks. And then he leaned across to her and beckoned to her and said, come here and have a drink with me." And Kasha made a great show of it, first being insulted and then reluctant and then coy, and she pursed her lips, and finally she relented and came over. And after they'd had a couple of drinks, he threw some coins to the piper and stood up and said, "Play! Everybody else off the dance floor. This song is for me and Kasha." And the two of them danced and danced and danced, and they danced all afternoon and right into the evening until they were exhausted. And finally this stranger offered to walk her home. And he walked her to the gate, and he said, "Good night, it's been a lovely evening." And Kasha said, "Oh, this has been a wonderful day. If only it could last forever." And he said, "Well, that could be arranged." And just like that, he took his true form as the devil that he was. And in a flash, he grabbed her and he took her right down to the gates of hell. So there he stood at the gates, feeling rather exhausted from all the dancing with Kasha hanging around his neck. And he knocked at the door, and the doors opened, and the other devils came up and said, "Wow, you look like hell." And he dragged himself through the halls with Kasha still clinging on him. Oh, my darling, she was so besotted because a man wanted her that she didn't see anything else. And soon the devil was standing before the Prince of Darkness himself. So this wasn't the devil, he was a devil, one of the employees. And the Prince of Darkness said, "What on earth is that you've got hanging around your neck?" And he said, This is Kasha." "Well, what is she here for?" And he said, "Oh, I was walking up and down upon the earth looking for some trouble, and I heard her say that she was willing to dance with the devil himself. And so I decided to have some fun, and I came and I danced, and then just to frighten her a bit, I took her down to hell, but now I can't get rid of her." And the Prince of Darkness said, "Well, you're on your own." That's what you get for wandering about the earth without really paying attention to what you're doing. So go off and solve it, and maybe this will be a lesson to you. So the devil clapped, and again they were back on the earth, but Kasha was she was hauled up on his back, and he's walking and walking until he came upon a young shepherd wearing his great shaggy coat, and he's tending his flock. And the shepherd said, "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," said the devil, and of course he was in a human form now. And the shepherd said, "Well, who clothes? What's that you've got around your neck? And he said, I was with my friend here, Kasha, and she was tired, and we're walking back to the village, and I told her I'd carry her, but I'm tired. And then the shepherd was a very good-natured young man, and he said, oh, let me help you carry her part of the way. And so he, good luck to you, said the devil, getting her up. And the shepherd said, Kasha, come here, come to me. And she turned and she looked and she saw, well, a handsome, outdoorsy young shepherd with his fine coat. And she leaped off away from the devil and gripped her arms around, jumped right on the shepherd's back and said, oh, this is my lucky day. And so the shepherd began walking off towards the town. But as he walked for some while, he grew tireder and tireder, and finally he said, Kasha, maybe you could just walk for a little while. Oh, my love, I'll never let you go. And he thought, how am I going to get rid of her? And finally he was walking past a pond, and he thought, if only I could just throw her into that pond. And he thought, well, my coat is very loose. He said, maybe I could slip out of it. So he slipped out of one sleeve. Kasha didn't seem to notice. And he slipped out of the other sleeve, and still Kasha saw nothing. And he carefully undid the top button, and then the second, and the third, and finally he undid the last button and slipped out and threw everything, Kasha and all, into the middle of the pond. And then he ran back to his flock, where the devil was still resting. And the devil said, how the hell did you get rid of her? And the shepherd said, oh, it was nothing. I just tossed her into the pond a ways back. And the devil got down on his knees and said, oh, thank you. I will do you a great favor someday in return for what you have done for me. And then he vanished. Now, what happened at this country where the shepherd lived was run by a duke, a dissipated young duke. Perhaps he was a thin white duke, I don't know. But he spent all his days gambling and drinking and all his nights carousing, and he did nothing for the country, so he appointed 2 governors. But they were even worse and more corrupt than he was, until with the exorbitant taxes and all their greedy laws, the country was being run into the ground. Now one day, this duke, for a lark, called in an astrologer and asked him to do his horoscope and that of his 2 pals, the governors. And the astrologer laid out his charts, but when he'd finished, he grew pale. And he began to roll them up and say, oh, well, that's that. And the duke said, wait a minute, so what's our future? What do the stars say? Nothing, everything's kind of cloudy. And no, said the duke. You must tell me what you have seen. And you must tell me the truth, because if you tell me a lie and it does not come to pass, then your life is forfeit. Well, so there was nothing for it but to tell him what he saw. And the astrologer told him that on the first quarter of the moon, on such and such a day, at such and such an hour, the devil was going to come for each of the 2 governors and carry them off to hell for all their sins. And on the night of the full moon, on such and such a day, at such and such an hour, he was coming for the duke. Well, when the duke heard this, he grew pale, as did his governors. The governors immediately packed up their things and grabbed all their wealth and locked themselves in their mansion. But the duke began to think about it, and he didn't want to be carried off to hell, so he decided to reform. And he began to make just laws and to do good, and he did everything he could, and the governors, too, began to reform, and they did everything their master told them to do, and soon things were much better in the country. Now, near the time of the first quarter of the moon, the shepherd was out tending his flocks, and the devil appeared before him and said, now is the time when I can repay your kindness to me. This is what you must do. I have been appointed to carry the 2 governors of this country off to hell at the first quarter of the moon. But because they have done so much good recently, the contract has been called off, but they don't know it. So here's what we'll do. On the appointed time and day, I will go and pretend to carry each of the governors out of their mansions, and you step forward and say, stop, release that man and trouble us no more. And I'll run off. And oh, he'll be so grateful to you, I'm sure he'll promise you at least 2 bags of gold. But listen to me now. the Duke was deemed to be so wicked that even, and despite his reforms and trying to mend his ways, I'm still appointed to take him to hell. So do not interfere with the Duke, because it might cost you your own skin. And the shepherd thanked him, and the devil vanished. And the shepherd waited till the appointed day, and he went down to the mansion where there was quite a crowd of people, because word had got out about this great event. And they were all waiting to see what was going to happen. And a moment later, behind the walls of the mansion, they heard a cry of despair, and the doors banged open, and out came the devil, dragging the poor, blubbering governor behind him. And the shepherd walked up and took the other arm of the governor and said, "Stop, devil! Let this man go, I command you, and trouble us no more." And the devil ran off. And of course, the governor begged him and thanked him and said, "I'll give you whatever you want." And he said, "Just 2 bags of gold will do nicely." And so it was done. And he just had time to hurry over to the mansion of the second governor, where he pulled off the same routine with his pal, the devil. Now word got around, of course, and the Duke heard of what had happened. And so he called the shepherd into his presence and said, "You must help me, you must. I've tried to do good, please." And the shepherd was rather good-natured, and he said, "You know, the country has been much better, and we don't know, who knows, but that the next Duke might be far worse than you, and you've done a good job, so I'll help you, even if it might cost me my life and soul." So the full moon came, and everyone was waiting outside. Now, when the people in the country first heard about the sentence of the Duke, they had rejoiced, but, you know, over time he had done a lot of good, so now they felt they were grieving, and they were rather sad about the whole thing. And then the shepherd was waiting, and the door banged open, and out came the devil, and the shepherd ran over and grabbed the Duke by the arm and said, "Stop, devil! Leave this fellow and trouble us no more." And the devil leaned in and said, "Hey, what the hell are you doing? Don't you remember what I told you?" And the shepherd said, "Listen up. I don't care at all about the Duke. I've just come to warn you. Kasha's gone home and out of the pond. She's all cleaned up. She's headed this way, and she's been asking for you." With that, the devil vanished. I didn't forget about Kasha. And the Duke was so grateful and impressed that he appointed this shepherd his chief counselor, and he treated him like a brother. And from then on, the country was won very well, because the devil had the very wisest of advice. That's the story.